Hey, AP Bio! Today, of course, is day 76, and our target today is to understand a thing called biomimetics, which is fascinating, and the true price of a t-shirt. Kind of a weird combination of topics. Now, you might recognize this little guy. He is a sharp-dressed man. Why is Finney such a sharp-dressed man? Well, because his grandma and his mommy dress him. And today he's wearing one of those fashionable things that you can have in Western society. We all have them. You probably own 40 or 50 of them. It's called a t-shirt. Oh, so comfy, so light. There's an interesting thing. If you look at t-shirts, you probably have too many of them, like most of us do. And you can get them just for random things, like wonderful t-shirt drives at school. Love that one. There's a weird thing. When you buy a t-shirt, there's this thing called a grizzly bear. When you buy a new t-shirt, a grizzly bear dies. Which doesn't seem right. Got to be a Neil thing, right? So that's what I want to know. How is it that when you buy a new t-shirt that a grizzly bear dies? What's up with that? YOLO, bro. Unless you're those Cubs, then you don't live for very long. But anyways. Cool. Write down the question. See if you can figure it out. And we'll see what I'm talking about, right? Cool. All right. Let's talk about you. Now, if we talk about you, one thing that, of course, you have is you have t-shirts. And you live in this lovely place called the Seattle area, right? Western Washington. There you are. And here you are, proud with your brand new t-shirt. It's so nice. Brings a smile to your face. Why not buy 12, right? Now, if we look at that, of course, did you go out into the woods, find a grizzly bear, skin it, and make your t-shirt out of it? Of course not. Because there are no grizzly bears around here anymore. There used to be grizzlies in the western United States throughout it. Lewis and Clark made the first run-in with those guys, and here's a really bad United States. In fact, if you look at the flag for California, there were grizzly bears all the way down in California. There used to be tons of them that would come down in Monterey Bay because Monterey Bay had so many whales that would die in that area because it was great feeding. They'd come down to feed on those. They put it on their flag, but they also, shot, poisoned, and killed all the grizzly bears because they're a very large predatory animal. They're an omnivore, but they'll eat meat. And they're scary. And what we tend to do with things that scare us is we kill them because they're competition. So you don't find grizzly bears around here. So where do you find them? Well, the only pocket of them that you can still find in the United States is this area called Montana and Wyoming. And it's this little spike where there's these two national parks where they've been protected. And in that area, you can, of course, if you're lucky, you can see some of their grizzlies. That's a scary eye. And the grizzlies, of course, are massive creatures. So I'm going to draw it while I'm talking, which is fun because it always comes out weird. And if we look at those grizzlies with their big old claws and their ability to stand like 7 to 9 feet tall, they're impressive creatures. You can see why early settlers would be scared of them. I mean, they're massive. They got a big appetite, especially in the fall, right? Now, for us, we're separated from those grizzlies by these high things called the Rockies, right? So one thing that's for sure is you're not crossing the Rockies going over to Wyoming and shooting grizzly bears to make t-shirts because you don't make t-shirts out of grizzly bears, right? Instead, what you make them out is most t-shirts and the most comfortable stuff. It's called the touch, the feel, the fabric of our lives. It's known as cotton, right? So are they planting cotton fields up in Montana and Wyoming and killing off the grizzly bears so they can do it? Heck no, cotton won't grow up there, right? Cotton's a thirsty plant. It needs hot places with lots of water. So if you're going to grow cotton, you want to go to a place in the United States which is famous for growing cotton, like the American South, right? This could be places like Arkansas or Mississippi, right? Now, if we look at those southern states, of course, one benefit to them is they have sandy soils that are well-drained, and it's a hot place, so cotton can grow well. That's why, we had a Civil War and stuff. The cotton, of course, if you're going to make a t-shirt, you're going to make it out of that cotton fiber. There's a trick to it. You want a t-shirt, right? And if I make this t-shirt out of cotton, I want to sell as many as possible. So how much does a t-shirt cost? Well, a t-shirt could cost, you could get it for $25. You could pay $50 for it. But if you really wanted a t-shirt, you could probably get it for less than $8. I've seen them on offer for $2. You could greatly reduce the price of the t-shirt, and then you could sell more of them. It's the idea of this thing called capitalism, right? In order to do that, though, you have to have the raw material to supply it be cheap. So we need cheap cotton, right? So that's the first step of this thing, right? There you are. There's your grizzly bear. And the cotton fields are way over here in Mississippi, right? But you want cheap cotton. So the secret is you go to where labor's cheap, down in the American South, right? And if we zoom in on this, we'll notice that this is a flat, well-drained area, sandy soil, which cotton can do well in if you treat it right. And the cotton will grow relatively fast, although it is extremely water thirsty, but that's why the Mississippi River and stuff are, basically being drained each year, sucking out most of the good stuff. It goes to thirsty crops like corn and cotton and rice and wheat and all those things, right? Now, the weird thing about the cotton is it's really just the fluffy cellulose coating that helps to spread the cotton seeds, kind of like our cottonwoods out here, right? Now, if you want to grow cotton, there's a problem. One, it's going to take a lot of water, and that water is going to have to be pumped from the surrounding areas. That's why wetlands are disappearing from all over the planet, right? In addition to that, you're going to need to make sure that when you secure this farmland, you've got it set up so that you can supply that cotton with enough nutrients to grow very, very, very quickly. So one of the other things you're going to need is this lovely stuff called fertilizer, right? And fertilizer, of course, is a problem because it's hard to produce. Typically you think of things like chicken manure and stuff like that. They use chicken manure, but more often than not, we use artificial fertilizers. Plant food to give them what they need. And of course, one of the key ways that we did that was by the Haber-Bosch process. If you remember back to chemistry, that means that really what we're using to build this thing is we're using energy to suck nitrogen out of the sky. And where we get the energy and the chemicals to do that is called petrochemicals. It's part of what's known as the petrochemical industry, right? And petrochemicals, as the name suggests, except for that we're Americans, these are things that are based on oil. They're oil-based products. So we not only pull it out of the sky to make things like nitrates and things like that, we also make a lot of other materials that we can use to harness and spray them on our crops, right? So one of the things that we should notice, of course, is when we do this, we're going to spray all over this field, this fertilizer, and what's going to grow? The cotton's going to grow, right? It's the miracle grow that makes it in, with the phosphates and all that stuff too. The only problem is it's also going to grow weeds, right? What we call weeds. Some places they call them native plants, but that's just where they're educated, right? Now, the problem is these weeds are going to soak up your water and they're going to soak up the fertilizer, which is going to cut down your cotton production and make your t-shirt more expensive. So what do? Well, you hire a bunch of people, you have them go out into the field, and they pick each of the weeds individually, right? No, all those people and their healthcare needs and a living wage. Oh, wait. No, that wouldn't happen anyway, because that would all push up the price of cotton. That's why anybody who works on a farm in the United States tends to be, on the lower socioeconomic status because, well, we want to keep the products cheap, so we can't pay for their health care, right? But that's a totally different story. So instead, what you do is simple. You do what's called mass spraying, and we want to get rid of plant pests. So we use these things called herbicides. That means that we can drive trucks or we can even fly, dusty crop hopper, the plane over this stuff and spray it in a mass spraying, because that's how we tend to apply it, so that it indiscriminately sprays all over the field. And when it does that, things like Roundup, it's going to kill those weeds like crazy. And if you engineer your cotton to be like Roundup ready, or your corn to do that, it won't die. So you can give it a really high dose and kill all those weeds and not have to pay a bunch of people, just the guy flying the plane and the company that produces, right? Roundup. Sounds like lawsuits, right? Oh, that's that carcinogen thing that has now been proven in U.S. courts to cause cancer in humans as well as massive problems in ecosystems, right? But the good news is you just sprayed it all over this field, right? So then what's going to happen? Well, it's the American South, and when the rainy season shows up, and typically it would flood in Louisiana and stuff like that downstream of it in Mississippi, it would rain all over this stuff, and then any of this exposed herbicide would then run off of that area, and where would it go? Well, it runs off into the areas that are too wet and, of course, too steep to grow the crops. And there used to be lots of areas like that. They were called wetlands, but those all got turned into farms. So the land in between them is what's called the marginal lands. And in those marginal lands, of course, you will find these things like native plants. We'd call them weeds, but they're native plants. They're things like milkweed, and they could be things like basswood, and all the plants that would grow in there. Lots of different flowers, right? Now, crazy thing about this is now what happens is all of that herbicide runs into these places. And as it runs into those places, it kills off the herbs. So it kills off the native plants that are living in those very, very small marginal areas. And like, oh yeah, big whoop, a bunch of weeds died. I don't really care, right? Well, one reason you should care is, the water that runs to people's wells in places like Mississippi, Arkansas, where this is happening, or anywhere there's agriculture, those then run into our groundwater, which then feeds into our water system. So they go directly back to us. It might be why there's a problem with cancer rates. Roundup and atrazine. Atrazine is one used on corn. It's famously known to once again create ovaries in the testes of amphibians, whose testosterone system works just like ours with their endocrine, right? I wonder why people are having reproductive problems. But it gets better. Not only do you want to kill the weeds, you also have a problem. Anytime you plant a crop and grow lots of it, especially in monoculture, you run into these things called pests. And those pests are things like aphids, or they could be caterpillars, right? And the caterpillars and the aphids, of course, are munching on your cotton crop or your tobacco or whatever cash crop you're going for. But the cotton they love. So what do? Well, you hire a whole bunch of people to go out and they pick the aphids and the caterpillars off and they squish them with their hand because that would be eco-friendly. No, then you'd have to pay for their kids' educations and stuff and like pay for school levies because they'd have to bring their kids with them or, just give them enough to survive. Not going to happen in the U.S. You want a cheap shirt, right? Goes against capitalism. So what you do instead is you mass spray these things called, of course, pesticides. And those pesticides, of course, are great because you spray them all over the field. They contain things like neonicotinoids. And if it sounds like nicotine, it's because neonicotinoids contain a nicotine-like chemical. They also spray caffeine on them as well, but the neonicotinoids are the most powerful. They basically go after the nervous system of the insects, the caterpillars, the aphids, all that stuff, and it causes them to freak out and then they die. And it can also shut down their immune systems so that they can be preyed upon by things like bacteria and viruses, right? It works awesome, kills the bugs like crazy, and you can do it for cheap because you can spray it. That also flows into these areas of the marginal lands, right? When it does that, a crazy thing happens. One, these plants that were being killed by the herbicides, they also were the feeding grounds of things like native moths and pollinators. And unfortunately for us, what we found out is all these butterflies and moths, which do a lot of pollination at nighttime, and the bees and everything, that would lay their eggs on these plants, especially the butterflies, and feed on them as caterpillars, their numbers are decreasing. Recent reports show that there's a 75% decrease in insect species around the world. That's kind of a big deal when you consider that, like, E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous biologists, said, you can make humans disappear and nothing would really notice. But if you knocked out insects, the whole world would collapse. Well, those animals, those insects that keep us alive, they do all the dirty work, like decompose things, pollinate all, 90% of your fruit that isn't grass-based, like corn and stuff. Anything that's like an apple, those guys are going extinct, which means less food for us. Oh, dear. Also, in addition to that, these marginal areas that have these small trees and shrubs and stuff, they're also a great place to see birds. And the birds, especially these types that the Audubon Society just loves and been keeping track of, are called songbirds, right? Warblers and chickadees and different types of jays, swallows, martins, all those things. They usually move through these areas and they feed on the pests. They even feed on the ones in the field that are now loaded with neonicotinoids, the ones that are left, because a lot of them die. And that means if we think about the last one, that biomagnifies the toxin into them. And unfortunately, like we found out with DDT, which shredded a bunch of, high top predators like eagles' shells, it's having an impact on the songbirds' ability to reproduce. They're not getting enough food and they're building up the toxin, but mainly their chicks are starving. So songbird populations are dropping by like anywhere from 70 to 90%, depending on where you are in the world, especially in the United States. So bye birds, bye natural insect eaters. Oh man, this isn't sounding good. But the good news is you end up getting this really cool shirt for dirt cheap, right? Now, the other part of this is tricky. Now that we've made this cheap shirt with the cheap cotton, we're not going to make the shirt here in the United States because that would cost too much money. So instead, we ship it down the Mississippi all the way to Bangladesh or China. They mass produce it, and then it can come into ports and things like LA or into Seattle itself or Portland. And that means that it ships it around the world. And as it does that, of course, that'll eventually get your nice cheap t-shirt because it was more cheap layer doing it. That means that it all has to be transported from its origin to you. So that's going to be a lot of transport if you consider all around the world to get that to you, because it's got to go to Bangladesh before it makes its way to t-shirt and then back to you. And that's all transported on hydrocarbons, right? That's about burning fossil fuels. That's a ton of CO2 for transport. And that might explain why, right now throughout the United States and the world, we're seeing this weird thing where the temperatures are increasing to the rate that actually flowers are now, going through fluorescence. They're blooming early. They're blooming so early that the insects that would pollinate them don't actually hatch out of their cocoons at the right time, because it's all timed out by millions of years of evolution together. And this early fluorescence is causing the insects to show up after the flowers have already died, because flowers don't last long. That's further decreasing native plants' survival. It's all connected to that global climate change thing where we're shifting our temperature gradients on Earth and moisture patterns, right? This, of course, is all linked to this idea of fragmentation, where we cut up nature and, of course, other things like global warming and global climate change. There's a lot of process, a lot of shuns in here, right? But this fragmenting of nature leaves it these little pockets that can't survive those big changes, and that's why we're seeing such decimating numbers in natural ecosystems, right? But the good news is you get a t-shirt, and putting in those farms, did that kill grizzly bears? Well, there's no grizzly bears. There never have been grizzly bears in Mississippi and Arkansas and stuff. They live in mountain environments. So how can destroying an ecosystem down in Mississippi affect bears that live up in the Rockies? Sounds like hooey, right? Well, think about the name. They're called the Rockies. Why are they called the Rockies? Well, if you've ever been to the Rockies, you'll find that they're made of sedimentary rocks. And as they break down through freezing and thawing and eroding, they leave these huge scree fields, jumbles of rocks all over the place, hence the Rockies, right? And if you go up into the Rockies during the late fall, there's one thing that you will find like crazy up in the Rockies. Grizzly bears, right? And if you've ever seen a grizzly bear, you'll notice that they're different than black bears because they have these huge, powerful shoulders, like a big hump on their back. And that's all muscle attached to their scapula, the bones. Why do they have those huge things? Well, one thing we know is they're very good at ripping open logs. They open them like a can opener to get into grubs and stuff like that. But if you go up into the Rockies in the late fall, you'll find tons of grizzlies up there just before the snow hits because they're stocking up on calories. But the weird thing is they're out in these scree fields and they're grabbing the rocks and they're flipping them. Boom, 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 boom. That's why they have the huge claws and the huge muscles to flip the huge boulders. And every once in a while you'll see them stick their face down and they're eating something. Well, what are they eating? Well, scientists went out and they found out what was in these scree fields. What's actually in the scree fields is underneath the rocks, and it's pupa. These pupae of, basically moths. It turns out that like 50 to 60% of their late fall diet, which is crucial for them, comes from these big fatty transforming moths in their pupa state that are just loaded with fat, and that's how they add on the extra pounds, because the next thing they're going to do is they're going to den up in the Rockies, where temperatures, of course, are going to be really, really cold, but they have enough snow to build ice dens. And they built up the calories, and they're going to sleep away the winter because there's not enough food in the natural ecosystem during the winter to do that. They've evolved to do that over millions of years. And these moths are the key to doing that, right? The only problem with that is you bought a t-shirt. And the shocking thing that scientists found out was that the moths that the bears are eating actually started their life out in the American Southeast, where they start off their life in this early spring, because spring comes earlier the farther south you are. And what they feed on is things like milkweed and the native plants that grew in those areas and now are on the marginal lands. The only problem is when you bought your t-shirt, you wanted a cheap t-shirt. And that meant that all those marginal lands had to get sprayed by this, mass spraying and reduced to have more farm fields that have cheaper things. So those moths died along with all the rest of the ecosystem that are there. Because what they used to do for millions of years is at the end of early spring, they would go into laying eggs, they would pupate, they would turn into caterpillars, pupate, and then turn back into moths as the spring faded, and then they would migrate thousands of miles up into the Rockies. And the moth migration involves, 2 generations. When they got to the Rockies, if you've ever been up to Mount Rainier and stuff, you'll notice that spring comes later in the mountains because it's higher up in elevation. So in the late spring, they would come up here, and the reason why you go up to like Mount Rainier and any pretty mountain is to see the beautiful meadows, which are full of flowers. So what the moths do is they come up, and as they make their way in here, they feed on those flowers, they do their pollinating, right? And then they lay their eggs, which hatch into caterpillars, which feed on these, and the second generation begins. And that second generation now, what it does is it actually goes into its pupa stage, but now it's too late. It's getting on to late summer, and fall's going to hit fast. So what they do in the fall is they go into a pupa state, and they're going to hibernate until the next year when they can hatch out during the spring and start the cycle all again, where their descendants would eventually make their way down to the American Southeast. This system worked really, really well for not only the moths, because there was things to pollinate and food to make and places to put their babies, but it worked crucially for the grizzlies because this is a huge fat reserve at the very time that they need it. Otherwise, they're eating grass most of the time and some berries, right? But when you bought the t-shirt, you cut the link in that chain because it killed off the first generation of the moths, which meant that they couldn't migrate. So when they're up in the Rockies there, the bears flip over the rocks, and what they're not finding is they're not finding the caterpillar pupas, right? They're not finding the moth pupas. So what happens for the bears, of course, is that means they lose weight. They get skinny. But winter hits regardless, so they have to go into their dens. And when they go into their dens, they don't have enough fat to sleep through the whole winter, surviving on just their fat reserves. So a lot of the grizzly bears now, what they're finding is in the middle of winter, when there shouldn't be any bears around, they've got bears that are coming out of their dens, waking up because they're starving to death. They're basically starving because they don't have enough of the reserves, and they're getting cold because they've eaten away at their fat. So what they're doing is they come out to try to find food. The only problem is up in the Rockies, there is no food at that time. So they're burning calories and not getting calories back. They're going through starvation, and many of the grizzlies are starting to die because of that. Now, worst off is the fact that because of global climate change, now the Rockies are actually seeing a higher snowfall. I know it seems weird. The earth gets warmer, there's more snow, but that's because it evaporates the Pacific more, which means more snow falls in the Rockies, just like it did in our mountains the last couple of years, Cascades. And that's because, of course, you evaporated more water, so now it's going to condense and form more snows, and you get heavier snowpacks, which means to find food, they got to dig even further. And on top of that, they're burning those calories. The problem is now it warms up in the mountains faster, so that increases the rate of the thaw, which means a lot of this water now thaws out and rushes down the hill, causing flooding, but also ripping away at the soil that supported those mountain meadows that took thousands of years to establish. So there aren't the flowers there to support the pollinators that they would feed on, or the grasses that they would eat, the bears, in the late fall. And the ones that it hits the most are the ones that have fat stored up not only for themselves, but for their newborn babies. What this is hitting the most is the pregnant females and those females that have cubs. Because those females den up, and the babies are born in the middle of winter inside the den, and they feed off mom's fat reserves. The only problem is mom doesn't have a fat reserve because you bought a t-shirt. It's a fat-looking t-shirt, but not for the bear. So now those mothers either have to come out of the den with really too young of cubs, or they basically starve to death in there, or the babies are miscarried in the first place. And that's how, when you buy a new t-shirt, a grizzly bear, sometimes 2 or 3 grizzly bears if it's a mama bear, die. It's almost like everything's connected. Now, I chose this story because everybody has a t-shirt, and it's a true story. It's based on research. And it's a story of how killing bears is, linked to what you buy, what you consume. But really, this is a broader story. I could have told it about anything. I could have told it with corn, because that's how you made your corn puffs. I could have told it with wheat, because that's how your Cheerios come about. I could have talked about the cotton from India and how it's killing, things like tigers because they need the industrial production and the agriculture to take their areas. I could have talked about it with pandas and how they're dying out because, of course, that's where they build the factories to make your iPhone, right? This really is the story of overconsumption by humans, taking more than you actually need from the environment, like 10 million t-shirts, right? Brand new and cheap because you can get it cheap, especially on some of them, Amazon accounts. Oops, said the name, right? The other part of this, of course, has to do with this thing called non-discriminate mass pesticide and herbicide use. Man is very good at making chemicals now. We've figured out through places like DuPont and Dow how you produce those chemicals so that you can kill off all the bugs and all the weeds very efficiently, but we also found out that many of them have long-term endocrine and immunological impacts on ecosystems, and they're decimating everything from songbirds to crickets, right? Especially bees, the pollinators. This, of course, is also tied to the fact that our materials that we overconsume, like our t-shirts, our cell phones, our TVs, our shoes, these are all linked to using the natural world. And the natural world is struggling because of a thing called fragmentation, right? What we basically have done is we've taken over the world and reduced habitats. We've turned things that were natural places, like wetlands in Mississippi and Arkansas, or, the suburbia that's here. We've turned those forests into farming areas or places where you put people, suburbia, right? This is so that we can grow things like food or textiles like cotton, right? Or we could look at things like suburbia. We basically need a place to live. We invented these things called cars, so now we can sprawl out of urban places and have more people. Those places used to be where wildlife occurred. That's why they're starving. They don't have any place to find food. It'd be like taking out all the shopping malls and saying, good luck, people, right? The other part of this has to do with this thing called transportation. We are a global species, and global commerce requires fossil fuels. And one thing we can see is that's produced a massive amount of CO2 as well as methane from our meat consumption that have increased the temperature of the earth, and that causes, of course, global climate change. Now, one thing that we can see with this, of course, is this is linked to the early flowering of plants that's decimating pollinators. It's also causing them to not match up with their pollinators so that plant species will go extinct as well. And it's increased the snowfall in places like the Rockies, right? That's why, of course, they're getting hitting wells and stuff. Number 5 part of this, of course, is the idea that this is basically linked to damaging ecosystems inside the United States, or the world for that matter, right? This is why bird populations, amphibians, as well as other things, like these crazy things known as, insects that hold our world together, are struggling to keep the planet going. Well, we all have our new materials, right? Now, you might ask yourself, okay, how do I fix this? Because I don't want to kill these cute little cubs to clothe that cute little cub. Well, I'll give you an idea. This sharp-dressed little man is wearing hand-me-down clothes. And I myself, I'm not the dressiest guy, but almost everything that I wear, I bought at a secondhand store like Goodwill. And that's because I don't care about fashion. I don't care about the way I look. I care more about the natural world operating and this little boy having a chance to not only survive, but a chance to experience the beautiful nature that I've seen in my life. It's a far richer experience. So when we say, of course, YOLO, bro, it's about, yeah, you only live once, but does your fashion statement require the death of other things? It's about asking yourself what it really costs for every item you buy. What's the real cost of a t-shirt or anything that you buy? And that's why even when you see my videos, the TV that's behind my head, it's a hand-me-down TV. I'm not going to go out and buy the latest TV. I don't have my own personal computer. I only use the one supplied by work because I don't need another one. The less that I buy, the less likely nature is to die. So I hope you think about the products that you need and that you use and ask yourself, before you buy something, do I really need that? Where was the source of that? What part of nature was destroyed to make that? And then maybe this little guy will have a chance to see these little guys. Or your little guy someday. So, food for thought. The second part of this ETD has a lot to do with this picture, the need for speed. I'm going to take a pause. I'll make a second video for you for that stuff. It's a beautiful Maikai shack. Oh, yeah, the Maikai. Mako means speed, of course, in Maori. Hey, Phelps in it. He shaves his armpits. I hope that what you recognize, of course, is our world is a fragile thing, and ask yourself, what is the price of everything you purchase from it? But that's why we're doing the Eco Issues Project, so that people can be aware of this stuff, right?